Hello and welcome to Topic 8, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at freedom of the press and democratic society. Okay, so what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to take a look at freedom of the press and the Constitution. And we're going to be asking the question, what constitutes the press? Then we're going to take a look at the role that the free press plays in democratic society. And we'll close this lecture out by looking at the decline in trust that we see in the United States and the news media. So that's what we've got on the docket. So let's get started. So it almost goes without saying that it's important that the press are free to report without restrictions. And we're going to be looking at these restrictions or the lack of those restrictions in the next lecture. It's important for the press to be able to report without restriction because, as we're going to see in a moment, it is the cornerstone of creating and maintaining a democratic society. And so the news media in the United States can report most anything it wants, even if, and especially if, it's critical of government actions and policies. And they can do this without fear of government retaliation. I've been thinking a lot about press freedoms recently, particularly in terms of the coverage of the war in Ukraine. And it just reminds me of how important it is to have press freedoms, because these kinds of press freedoms do not exist in all countries. And so while in the United States, the news media can report without fear of retaliation from the government, this is obviously not the case in other countries, primarily authoritarian countries. I think many of you are probably familiar with what that picture shows on the screen there, because it got a lot of coverage in both international and American news media. And, so that is a picture of Marina Oskopakova. She works for Russia Channel 1, which is a state-owned news media source. And she came on to the show unannounced during a live broadcast, interrupting it and holding up that sign that says no war and condemns the Moscow's military action in Ukraine. So that got a lot of news coverage. And if you saw that news coverage, Russia Channel 1 just immediately cut to like another bit of programming, just basically not allowing her to be on the stage. And so it's a visual illustration of the tight control that Russia and other authoritarian regimes have over their news media. Since the war in Ukraine began, that there's been a crackdown on news media. There are a couple of independent news media sources in Russia, and they've all shuttered their doors because they're worried about criminal prosecution. Russia forbids journalists from using certain words, and so that they can't use the word war or invasion when covering the activities in the war in Ukraine, but instead they have to say special military operation. And in addition to that, there have been other crackdowns on journalists as well. There's an additional law that penalizes any coverage that news media might do that contradicts what the Kremlin is saying about the war in Ukraine. They said that anyone who engages in fake news could get a jail sentence up to 15 years. And so, when thinking about the importance of press freedom, you kind of look at Russia, and it's no wonder that, state-run polls that have been taking place in Russia. Now, how accurate those polls are, but it says 70% of Russians support the military actions that Russia is taking against Ukraine. And that's basically because they don't have access to a free media. But in the world where we do have freedom of press, and that is not just the United States, but most of Europe as well, and other places as well have vibrant free medias, but Europe, the United States, they've done extensive coverage on the war in Ukraine. And if you paid attention to the news media in the last couple of days, there have been, now that Russian forces have left Bucha, the suburb outside of Ukraine or outside of Kiev, that the photojournalists and other news reporters are covering the damage, the devastating atrocities that took place in that suburb outside of Kyiv. Those pictures have come out in the last couple of days. And this is just one of them. This shows a 72-year-old woman who basically, now that the Russian soldiers have left, is sort of surveilling what's going on. And it just, shows just civilians. These are not soldiers that have just been indiscriminately shot by Russian soldiers as they were leaving. There's also been reporting and images of people being executed, hands behind their back, of rapes and other war crimes. And so on the one hand, when, we have this world that is shut off from all the realities of the war in Iraq or the war in Ukraine that's taking place in Russia, the rest of the world is seeing these images in large part due to freedom of the press. And there's been really a global outcry due to these atrocities. The UN Security Council is meeting. There's, talks about, holding Putin and others accountable in the International Criminal Court. And so it shows sort of the real world consequences of the importance of a free media. So we are acutely aware of the importance of free press, in large part because the framers were also acutely aware of the importance of freedom of the press. And, so your textbook talks about how the framers recognized the importance of free press in and of itself, and they come from a long common law tradition from Britain that also embedded freedom of press within their laws prior to us becoming an independent nation. But your textbook also talks about that the framers recognized the importance of the freedom of the press because it also protects other personal freedoms. And so in a moment, we're going to talk about some of the specific roles that the free press plays in maintaining a democratic society. But your textbook talks about how the framers were, they saw that the freedom of the press leads to the press serving as a watchdog. And that if other rights are being violated, such as the rights of free speech or religious liberties or any other rights, failure to right to counsel, what have you, that the press is there to investigate that and to be a watchdog and to make us aware when other liberties are being violated as well. And so obviously this concern about making sure that there's freedom of press and its importance for a whole host of liberties, maintaining a whole host of liberties within a democratic society. I mean, obviously that's why there's constitutional protections for the press in the Bill of Rights. And so First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. So when you think back to what we were talking about when it came to religion and religious freedoms, one of the first things we talked about was what constitutes a religion. And so from the court's perspective, it's important to define what religion is, because when people act in the name of religion, they receive constitutional protections. So we spent some time, and you guys just worked on that with your midterm exam. So we're talking about the evolution in terms of the way that the Supreme Court has defined religion. Well, the same is important for knowing who the press is. Since the press is protected by the First Amendment, we have to have sort of an idea of who the press is. So who is the press? So courts, have surprisingly sort of struggled with what seems like an easy question. I mean, if I asked you, what constitutes the press, you'd probably say that it's, mainstream examples from mainstream media are pretty easy to recognize as press. So if I asked you what the press is, you'd probably say, newspapers, magazines, maybe broadcast news like the evening news, the national news, local news, etc. And so, it almost goes without saying that when we talk about freedom of the press, it includes those kinds of mainstream media categories. But there's a lot of press that's out there, right? And there's a lot of ways to disseminate information. And so, the question is, are all of these different ways that people are trying to inform people of things, do those actually constitute press, and do those entities receive First Amendment protection? So what about blogs? Blogs are, sort of individual postings that people make. They're not as popular today as they have been in the past. But in there, that whether you're a news journalist or not, you might have a blog, and you might use that blog to publish information for other people, right? And so is a blog press? How about magazines, like small zines? I don't even know if they have those anymore, right? They might have been replaced by everything on the internet. Freelance writers who are writing and informing, like sort of citizen journalists, are they a member of the press or pamphleteers? So like when we talk about freedom of the press and press protections, who are we talking about? And, what is deserving of First Amendment protection? Well, for the most part, when you look at what the court has said about who the press is, that most likely blogs, zines, freelance writers, pamphleteers, they most likely would be considered press by the court. And clearly, broadcast news, newspapers, and magazines, without doubt, are covered by the First Amendment. And so when we talk about what the First Amendment protections to the press extend to, that what I could find in terms of the defining of who is the press was a decision by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in 1987, and I felt like this did a good job of sort of capturing what the courts have said in terms of what is defined as press. And so First Amendment protections extend to every sort of publication which affords a vehicle of information and opinion. So, furthermore, in this opinion of the Second Circuit, they said that the essential point, which the appellate court agreed with, is that a journalist is not something you are, but it's rather something that you do. Right? And so when you look at what a person does, if what they are doing is they are publishing things as a vehicle to inform people of events and inform people of political opinion, and they are doing that in some sort of capacity where it reaches out to others, whether it's broadcast or whether it's on the internet, most likely that's going to be covered by the First Amendment. But, the Supreme Court does go case by case. There's no absolute definition of what the press is. And so as we've sort of seen throughout a lot of our studies that, on a case by case basis, sometimes, the Supreme Court would weigh in and make a determination of whether or not this person whose ability to spread information is being curtailed, whether or not they are in fact fall into the category of press. All right, so let's turn our sights now to the role that the free press plays in a democracy. And the role that it plays falls into three categories. One is that the free press informs the people, and so it's necessary to have an informed citizenry because democracy is government of, for, and by the people, and for that to actually be a kind of form of government that works, you need the people who are taking action, electing people, weighing in on which policies that they want. They have to do it in an informed way. And the more informed that you are, the more likely you are to be active, to vote and participate in politics. And so the free press allows people to get informed in a democracy. Another role that the free press plays is that the free press serves as a watchdog. And that, democracies, in particular constitutional democracies, work best when power is checked. And so our framers were really mindful of that in terms of making sure that we had three branches of government where we divide the power between those, we separate the power between those three branches, so that if one of the branches tries to engage in power that it's not authorized or doesn't have the jurisdiction to be involved in, the other branches will push back and say, hey, get out of our power lane, right? Those aren't your powers, Congress. Those are the powers of the president. The press serves as a watchdog, that in terms of that while the three branches of government keep a check on themselves, the news media keeps a check on government and will report out abuses of power. And so that is another contribution that the free press makes to democratic society. And then finally, the free press provides a public forum. That expression is magnified when it gets press coverage. And so we'll, in a second, dig in and look at some examples of how the press provides public forums and how that supports democratic society. All right, so let's first look at the role that the press plays in a democratic society, and that role is that they inform the people. So without the free press, we have to ask ourselves, well, where would we get information about the government and important issues that are going on? So if we didn't have a free press, where would we get that information? Well, it's likely that we would get that information from the government itself, right? So if the press wasn't there to ask questions of the president or senators or lawmakers or governors, right? Well, then how do we get that information? Well, that information would come from the government, and then information would be kind of curated in a way or shaped and framed in a way that would most likely be beneficial to the pursuits of the government. And so just as we're seeing in the example with Russia, that it's not a war, but it's a special military operation. So that's a good example of, if you don't get your news from the press, you're going to get it from the government, and the government is likely to frame it in a way that is most beneficial to their ends. And so, a free press is free to report without fear of retaliation from the government. And what that means is that it is a conduit for providing an opportunity for people to learn about issues, to get more, information about a particular issue, that to evaluate an issue. So the news media, at least good news media, often has the objective news reporting that goes on, which is supposed to be free from any sort of subjective bias or frame. And it's there where you're just getting information. But good news media sources also will have news analysis, right? That isn't promoting a perspective, but is sort of looking at the news through a critical lens and giving us sort of an analysis that allows us to think more critically about the issues that are going on that you're learning about. And then also news media will, oftentimes print op-eds and opinion pieces. They're clearly labeled as opinion pieces. So when you're consuming news media, you should make sure that if it's on the op-ed piece, it's not objective. It will be fact-based, but it will promote a particular perspective. And so, but that's good too, because it's important to hear perspectives on, whether or not, sticking with the war in Ukraine, NATO is really hesitant to take action to protect Ukraine because they're worried that Putin will retaliate with a nuclear attack, right? That it will be the beginning of World War III. Well, it's nice to read op-eds that come from different perspectives. Some op-eds would make the case that that's not likely to happen, right? Putin is more bluster than actual bite, and that maybe NATO should defend Ukraine, particularly since they're experiencing such grave losses. So in informing people, it also gives people opportunity to think differently about a particular news event. And that you can use that information to cast an informed vote. And so we have lots of elections. We actually have an election today in Milwaukee, and I think throughout Wisconsin, for electing our local officials. The news media is there to help cover any candidate forums that are going on, to give you information about positions on candidates, and in theory allows you to cast a vote that is based on unbiased information. And then finally, though, in informing the people, that the press levels the playing field between the people and political elites. So political elites, without the press, could basically say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have information, people. You don't have the proper tools you need to evaluate the situation, or let us give you the information so that you can evaluate this. So by having an external third party like the free press to give the people information, it basically puts the people on more of a level playing field in terms of being informed and also thinking critically about the policies and other activities that the government is pursuing. Another role that the press plays in a democratic society is to serve as a watchdog. The press is often referred to as the fourth estate. And so what does that mean? Well, it's referred to as the fourth estate because we have three estates within a democratic structure of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary, which we're learning about this semester. But that's not enough, for a democracy to function. Sure, you need people to take actions. You need to, put those actions you need to execute those actions. Then you need to settle disputes that arise, in terms of the decisions that are made and the way that those decisions are executed. But you need something more. You need to have a free press. And we talked about why that's necessary in some of the previous slides. The free press informs the citizenry. It provides a public forum, which we're going to be talking about in a moment. So you really can't have a true democracy without these four estates. Another thing that the press does in terms of the fourth estate is that the press serves as a counterbalance to those other governmental powers. And so we talked about that power is separated into these three institutions: legislature, executive, and judiciary. And the thinking is that there's sort of pull and tug between those different institutions. Like when the legislature tries to abuse its power, the judiciary or the executive branch will push back in order to kind of keep the legislature sort of curtailed within its appropriate powers. And the press serves as a counterbalance to all of the government powers, right? It serves as a counterbalance because it acts as a watchdog. And so the press scrutinizes the actions of elected officials and also public and non-public figures. And so, and the way that they do this is through investigative reporting. And so one of the cases that you're going to be reading this week is the case of the Pentagon Papers. And, the Pentagon Papers, Watergate, and the role that Washington Post and the New York Times played in sort of uncovering an abuse of power by the United States government is really good examples of that watchdog power. The Watergate, you guys might be too young to remember, but the Watergate scandal was President Nixon who basically hired people in order to break into the Democratic National Headquarters to help him get reelected in the 1972 presidential election. And had it not been for Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who as young journalists at the Washington Post investigated that break-in and followed and investigated to the point where they actually saw that break-in was approved of by President Nixon, which ultimately led to his resignation. Had they not done that investigative journalism, we might not have ever known about that grave abuse of power. And you'll be reading about the Pentagon Papers, which is where both the New York Times and the Washington Post print portions of the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers is this study that was done by the Department of Defense that looked at a lot of the errors that the Department of Defense made during the course of the Vietnam War, but how that even though that they were making errors and that they knew that their strategies weren't really working in Vietnam, they didn't let the public know about that. And so those are really two good examples of that watchdog function, that it basically doesn't just inform the public, but it basically holds those who lead us accountable because we know what they've done wrong. And then when we learn about it, we either the president resigns in the case of Nixon, or in other cases that we may not reelect those individuals, or they might change the policy that we've learned about and make changes in order to make sure that public policy is actually achieving the goals that it was designed to achieve. And then finally, the press serves as a public forum. And so not only does the news media inform the people, but the news media provides an opportunity to debate political issues and policies. And we find that sort of public forum feature of the news media in candidate debates. And so oftentimes candidate debates are hosted by the news media because it's this opportunity to hear the different perspectives of the candidates before you vote for them. Town halls are oftentimes, broadcast. The activities of Congress through C-SPAN, right, are broadcast so that we can be more informed and see what's going on in public forums, even though we might not be able to be there in person. And, the coverage of social media, citizen journalism, where citizens act as journalism to do reporting, all of that provides this sort of place where people can come and report out on what's going on, or where people are protesting, and then the news media is there to cover it so that we can have this opportunity to debate really important political issues. And to stick with the example of the war in Ukraine, you might have noticed that President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is just really a master at using the media as a public forum. And so he's posted a lot of videos on YouTube and through social media that is basically, making a case to the world about why we need to defend Ukraine. Just yesterday, President Zelensky posted a speech that was half in Russian and half in Ukrainian, and it was tailored towards hoping that people in Russia might actually watch the speech and learn about the atrocities that are going on. And so that is also a good example because, you can use social media like YouTube to broadcast a speech like President Zelensky, but then the news media picks that up too, sort of broadening out that public forum. So we know that having a free press is essential to a democratic society. And a lot of, what in the textbook, what you'll be reading about are efforts or activities that the government engages in to curtail the power of the press. But as you're also going to be learning that there are, particularly on print media, there are very few restraints that are placed on print media, more so in broadcasting, and you'll be reading about that in the textbook, why broadcast media is sort of treated differently than print media, mostly because with print media, you have to be intentional in terms of buying the newspaper or the magazine, so you kind of bring yourself to that. But in broadcast media, you could be in the car and rolling around on the dial on the radio, and you might begin listening to or hearing something that you didn't want to hear, and so there's more restrictions on on broadcast media, also because it's sort of using a public good, the public airwaves, in order to broadcast. Okay. And so, this chapter is sort of dedicated to the government restraining the freedom of the press. But, when you really think about it, given the level of free press that we have in the United States, maybe the greatest threat to the freedom of the press isn't the government and the curtailing actions of the government, but maybe the biggest threat to the freedom of the press is the people. And I say that because even though large percentages of Americans say that a free press is very important to maintaining a strong democracy, you could see there 64% of Americans say that, that you need to have a free press to have a strong democracy. That number seems a little low to me, right? 64, you'd think it'd be higher in the 90s, but well, maybe they should take civil liberties. But so while Americans report that they think free press is important to maintaining a strong democracy, there's growing distrust of the news media. People don't trust the news media anymore. And that distrust is really polarized, right? So that those, the people that have the most distrust in the media are likely to be either conservative or independent, right? And so it's sort of like when you look at, we're already polarized as a nation, but our attitudes toward the news media is polarized as well. Liberals and Democrats are more likely to trust the media. Conservatives are a lot less likely to trust the media. And so, we have a free press, but does the free press really matter if significant portions of the population consider what the press is reporting to be fake news? So let's take a look at the trend in trust in media, and then maybe do a little bit of critical thinking about that. And so here is a graph that takes a look at the polling on asking people the question about whether they trust the media. And this shows the trend from the 1960s and 70s onward until this is the most recent data I could find, October of 2021. And you can basically see that, we see kind of a decline this is people who responded that they have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the news media. And as of 2021, that only 7% of adults in the United States said that they had a great deal of trust in the news media, and only 29% said that they had a fair amount of trust in the news media. On the flip side of that, 29% of the public currently registers that they don't have very much trust in the news media, and a full 35% say that they don't trust the news media at all. Okay, and so we see that it's that trust in media has always been low in the United States, but that it has kind of somewhat of a downward trend, kind of it just kind of visually lets you know sort of like the low level of, and this is those who have, trust in the news media. So it's been pretty stable, but it kind of goes down a little bit as well. And so, I guess you could sort of ask yourself, is that a cause for concern that 34% of people have no trust in the media at all? And you could say, well, probably some distrust of the media is good. You want to be a critical consumer of the news media. And that is probably, when you say that people have somewhat or a fair amount of trust in the news media, that's probably a good sign. You don't want to just believe everything that the news media is saying. But when you have, more than a majority of people in the United States who say that they don't have very much trust or no trust at all in the news media, that can be kind of problematic. Particularly if we depend on the news media for getting information. And I teach American government, and a lot of times my students will be like, well, I can't trust the news media at all, so I don't really read the news media. There's nothing out there that's trustworthy to read. And it's just not the case. There are a lot of trustworthy news media sources: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, the BBC. There's a lot of trustworthy media out there. But I think that distrust levels are just so overwhelming in the United States that a lot of times my students sort of opt out of reading the news, this thing that's so crucial to a democratic society, just because they are under this impression that all of the news media out there is biased and untrustworthy. And that's just, the facts just don't bear that out. And this is a graph from Gallup also that basically shows the breakdown in trust in media from the different partisan perspectives. So they asked people who are taking the poll, do you consider yourself to be a Republican, independent, or Democrat? And then this graph basically shows you the breakdown of those who, the blue line, let me put on my magic pen here. The blue line, this is going to be the line that is the Democratic Party. The red line is those who affiliate with the Republican Party. And then in the middle are those who say that they are independents. And boy, you can really see the huge gap. And this is showing people who have a lot of, or a fair amount of, a great or a fair amount of trust in the media. And so, you see Democrats coming in at having 68% of trust in media, where Republicans, come in at, 11% trust in media, which is actually a little bit of an uptick from the year before, which was 10%. And independents find themselves, somewhere in the middle there. And so we really have different levels of trust in the news media. And, you have to ask yourself, why is it breaking down in party lines like that? I mean, it could very well be that there's this, I think there's this general perception in the United States that all of the news media has a liberal bend to it. And while we do have some, obviously, liberal programming like MSNBC, but we also have, conservative programming too with Fox News, right? And there are lots of news sources, as I said, that are not, partisan, that do and are dedicated to, they've got a long commitment to objective news journalism. But, it just seems like the general take that in a talking point, particularly among the Republican Party, is that the news media, all of the news media, is fake news. They call it the lamestream media, and that there's a sense of that, just like many other institutions and lack of trust that we have in other institutions, the deep state, that the media is just a part of that, and that it's much better to trust what the party leaders are saying, or rather than what you're finding in the media. Okay, it could also be that Democrats are more likely to trust the news media because they feel like the Republican Party, that the news media is under attack. So you really see an increase in Democrats' trust of the news media as it reflects to the election of Donald Trump. So that could also have a partisan sort of bend to it as well, as it's sort of like an increased support for trust in media because it falls along with your own particular party lines, right? That the news media is telling the truth, so you can trust it. Okay, that's it for this lecture. This lecture was really designed to kind of give you this foundational understanding of why free press is important to a democratic society. In the next lecture, we're going to get into the more of the core of what's in the chapter, and so we'll look at what the court have said in terms of what kinds of freedoms do the press have, and so the right to publish freely, and we'll be learning about this concept known as prior restraint, and we'll look at the court's development of the prior restraint doctrine. All right, thanks for paying attention. I appreciate it, and I'll talk to you again soon.